The nurses at Marigold Private Recovery Clinic whispered about him before he even arrived. He bought out the entire top floor, said one, eyes wide behind her glasses, 10 suites just for himself. He's been refusing treatment for over a year, said another, even after the accident. He hates being touched, won't let anyone near him. They passed rumors like notes between classes, some saying his face had been burned beyond recognition, others claiming he'd simply gone mad with grief after losing someone. But when the sleek black sedan finally rolled up beneath the ivy-covered archway of the clinic, and the man in question emerged with slow, deliberate movements, they all fell silent. Graham Astor stepped into the white marble lobby like a shadow moving through sunlight. He was tall, lean, and carried an unnatural stillness, as though everything inside him had been sealed tight. The right side of his face bore faint scarring, evidence of old trauma, not disfigurement, but it was the look in his eyes that made people turn away. They were winter gray, unflinching, hollow. He didn't greet anyone, he didn't offer a smile. He simply nodded to the silent security team that flanked him and allowed himself to be led up the private elevator. Nina Reyes, head nurse of the post-surgical rehabilitation ward, didn't pay much attention to gossip. She'd seen too much in her 10 years, wounded soldiers who flinched at sunlight, stroke survivors who'd forgotten their own names, mothers who wept silently through physical therapy. Pain came in many forms, and arrogance was often its mask. Still, she wasn't expecting to be assigned to him. "You've got a store," her supervisor said, handing over the file. "He requested someone with trauma experience. You're the only one he didn't veto." "Did he give a reason?" He said, and I quote, "At least she doesn't talk too much." Nina raised a brow but said nothing. Her first visit to his suite was like entering a mausoleum. The windows were covered, the walls were bare. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and solitude. Graham sat in a high-backed chair by the fireplace, though there was no fire. He wore a black sweater and dark jeans, both tailored but loose, like he didn't want fabric to cling to his skin. He didn't look up when she knocked once and entered. "I'm Nurse Reyes," she said quietly, "here to begin your assessment." "I don't want one," he said. His voice was low, textured, not unkind, but impenetrable. She moved slowly, deliberately. No clipboard, no laptop, just a soft-spoken presence. "Noted," she said, "still I'm here. I don't need care, I'm only here because my team insisted." "They were right to," Nina replied, meeting his gaze. "You survived a severe plane crash, your leg was shattered, there's still visible muscle atrophy, and from what I gather, you've barely walked in 6 months. You read my file. I read the parts that matter." Silence settled between them. She didn't fidget or fill the space with words. She waited. Eventually, he lifted his eyes to her. There was something tight in his jaw, like every second of interaction was costing him something. "You're wasting your time," he said. Nina shrugged lightly. "I've wasted it on worse." A flicker of something annoyance maybe passed through his expression, but he didn't tell her to leave, so she sat just across from him and began asking simple questions. "What hurts today? What movements feel limited? What do you miss doing most?" He answered only one. "I miss forgetting my body exists." It wasn't a typical answer, but she didn't treat it like one. "Let's start with breath work," she said gently. "I told you." "No touching," she agreed, "just breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth." He stared at her for a long time. Then slowly, stiffly, he inhaled. Nina didn't smile, she didn't praise. She just mirrored his breath until the silence no longer felt sharp. The first session lasted 15 minutes. He didn't thank her when she left. But he didn't tell her not to return. The next day she brought a folded quilt and set it on the couch before beginning their session. It was pale blue, stitched with careful lines, nothing extravagant, just soft, clean, familiar. "What's that for?" he asked without looking at it. "Texture variation," she said, "for seated exercises." "You mean comfort. Doesn't hurt." She didn't mention how he winced when he bent his knee, or how he turned his face away each time she got too close. She simply adjusted the routine, gave him space, and let his body dictate the pace. By the fourth session, he asked for the fireplace to be lit. By the sixth, he spoke before she did. "You don't ask about the crash. I figure if you wanted to talk about it, you would. You don't wonder." She looked at him evenly. "I wonder what kind of tea you like, but I haven't asked that either." He blinked, something in his mouth twitched, almost a smile but not quite. Earl Grey, he said. She made a note in her mind. By the end of the second week, he stood with her help, though she didn't touch him directly. She used a cane she'd specially requested, wrapped in supple leather for his grip, and guided him with words. And one morning, without warning, he asked, "Have you ever lost someone?" She was quiet a moment, then nodded. "My brother, he was a medic, didn't make it back." She didn't say more, didn't offer platitudes or anecdotes. Just sat in the silence that followed, warm and open. Graham said nothing, but the next day he asked her to sit with him by the fire when the session was done. She did. She stayed until he fell asleep in the chair, breath even, face turned toward the warmth. And when she rose to leave, she found a note left on the table beside her chair. Just 2 words. Thank you. Nina didn't mention the note the next day. She just placed a small tin of Earl Grey on the table before their session and said, "Figured you might want some." Graham glanced at it, then at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't say thank you this time, but when she reached for the cane, she noticed the fireplace was already lit and 2 chairs had been drawn closer together, angled just slightly inward. Progress came in strange shapes. That morning she guided him through a series of gentle standing stretches, always narrating each movement before suggesting it, allowing him time to refuse. But he didn't, not once. His focus was sharp, jaw tight with concentration, breath shallow with effort. "You're holding your breath," she said softly. "I know. Try not to let the exhale soften the tension." He gave a short, humorless breath. "Everything's tension. Then we start there." He paused, then he exhaled long and slow. When the session ended, she didn't rush to leave. Neither did he. She noticed how he adjusted the sleeve of his sweater to cover the edge of the scar near his wrist, and how his fingers hesitated just above his knee as if considering touching the place that still hurt. "You know," she said quietly, "there's a difference between healing and hiding." His eyes flicked to hers. "I'm not hiding." Then why the 10 empty rooms upstairs? The question hung between them, a soft challenge, not judgment, just curiosity. He didn't answer. But that night she received a message on her clinic tablet, "Come tomorrow at 7, I'll be ready." He was waiting when she arrived, dressed in exercise gear for the first time, navy joggers, a simple cotton shirt. His arms were lean but defined, pale from months indoors. The scars were more visible now, faint lines running down from his collarbone to his ribs, another webbing just under his elbow. She didn't stare, but she didn't look away either. They didn't start with stretches. He asked her to walk with him down the corridor outside his suite. It was quiet on the top floor, just the hum of ambient music from unseen speakers and the occasional flicker of art on digital frames. "You're the first person I've spoken to for longer than 5 minutes in months," he said as they walked. "Does that scare you?" "No, should it?" "I've worked with combat vets, burn survivors, mothers who lost children. Silence isn't the hardest thing." "What is?" "When someone gives up." He glanced at her. "You think I gave up?" "I think you were trying not to feel, which is its own kind of pain." He looked ahead again, the line of his jaw set tight. They passed the other rooms, all dark, untouched. When they reached the end of the hall, he stopped by a window. The drapes had been pulled back. Below, the garden shimmered in soft evening light, the lavender just beginning to bloom. "I used to build things," he said. "Before the company went public, before I became a name instead of a man, I designed real things, steel, concrete, glass." "Do you miss it?" "I miss caring." She didn't speak, she let the weight of that confession settle. "I was with someone," he said after a long pause. "Before the crash, we argued before takeoff, she didn't make it." Nina's breath caught, she didn't offer pity, just presence. "She was the last person who touched me. Her hand was on mine and I pulled away." He looked at his hand now, as if he could still feel the echo of that moment. "Now I flinch when anyone gets close, even you." "I've noticed," she said softly. "Doesn't that bother you?" "No," Nina said, "because I'm not here to fix that. I'm here to walk with you until it bothers you." He turned toward her. His eyes were quiet and full and unbearably tired. And for the first time, she saw it not as guardedness, but grief. The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm. Early mornings, shared tea, slow steps down the hallway, gradual progress. He no longer recoiled when she passed the cane into his hand, even let her adjust his posture with brief touches, a light pressure on the shoulder, a guiding hand at the back of his spine. It wasn't just the therapy that shifted. Graham began to ask about her, small questions spaced apart, where she grew up, why she became a nurse, whether she liked jazz because he heard it in the background of one of her playlists. Nina answered honestly but never forced stories. She let the answers arrive like footsteps, measured, intentional. One morning he said, "You're not like anyone else I've known." She looked up from where she was helping him adjust a resistance band. "Why that?" "You don't need me to be anything else." "You don't scare me, Graham," she said, using his name for the first time. He blinked, then looked down, and for a moment there was the barest smile at the corner of his mouth. "I used to have to buy every ounce of that kind of trust." "You don't have to buy it here." A long silence followed. And then as she reached to collect the band, his hand brushed hers. He didn't flinch. Neither did she. It wasn't a grand moment, just skin, contact, warmth. But Graham froze and she felt the tremor in his fingers, not fear this time, something deeper, sadder, something long buried that had just remembered what human connection felt like. He withdrew his hand slowly. But he didn't apologize. And the next morning when she knocked, the door was already open. The door being open changed something. Nina stood in the threshold for a moment, watching him. Graham was at the window, one hand resting on the frame as if grounding himself. Morning light caught his profile, tracing the healed scars on his temple in gold. She stepped in, he didn't turn. "I thought you hated mornings," she said gently. "I slept," he replied, voice low, "the whole night." She smiled, slow and quiet. "That's progress." It didn't feel like progress, it felt like peace. I'd forgotten the difference. She didn't move closer, just set her bag down and waited. "I kept hearing your voice in my head," he added after a moment, "telling me to exhale. Glad I'm haunting you in a helpful way." Finally he turned. There was a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen before, not pain, not caution. Hope. Not loud or obvious, but there. He gestured to the armchairs by the fire. "Can we skip therapy today?" Nina tilted her head. "You're allowed a rest day." "I just want to talk, if that's okay." It was more than okay. They sat by the hearth, the scent of bergamot and cedar wafting gently between them. Graham had started drinking the tea she brought, though he never said anything when she set it down. He just accepted it, like he was practicing the act of receiving care. "What was she like?" Nina asked quietly, not prying, inviting. He didn't have to ask who. "Lucia was too bright for me," he said. "She used to sing while cooking, she used my shirts as painting rags, she hated my silence and loved it anyway." His voice was steady, but something behind his eyes flickered. "She never wanted the money, said the house I built was too big, she liked little things, coffee cups, sunlight on old floors, wore my watch because she said time moved slower on my wrist." Nina listened without interrupting. "We weren't married," he added. "Everyone assumed we were, but we kept saying we had time." He closed his eyes for a long moment. "When the plane went down, she reached for me. I was angry about something small, I don't even remember what, and I pulled away. I watched her die with that distance between us." Nina didn't speak, her own breath had gone still. "I wake up hearing her breathing. Sometimes I think I can feel her hand on mine again, but then I move and I remember I didn't take it." He opened his eyes, they were glassy but dry. "Every time someone touches me now, it feels like betrayal, like I'm taking something I didn't earn." Nina reached down and poured tea into his cup, setting it in front of him. "It's not betrayal to need comfort," she said softly. "She loved you, she wouldn't want you to go untouched for the rest of your life." Graham looked at her, his gaze deep, searching. "I'm afraid I'll forget her." "You won't, but healing doesn't mean leaving her behind. It means carrying her forward, without punishing yourself for surviving." He stared into the cup, silent. Then, quiet as breath, "Will you sit closer?" She moved her chair just a few inches, enough for warmth to pass between them without pressure. He didn't reach for her, but his hand rested open on the arm of the chair. And she mirrored him. No touch, just presence. Just the simple, vulnerable act of allowing someone to be near. That evening she stayed past her shift. He asked her to, and she didn't need a reason. They played music, his playlist, not hers. Old jazz, blues with dust in the piano keys, saxophones that wept rather than sang. He told her about his childhood, cold summers in Vermont, a father who loved balance sheets more than bedtime stories, a mother who taught him how to hold a wrench before he could write his own name. He hadn't spoken this much in years. The words came slow but steady, like stones lifted from a riverbed one by one. And Nina let him. That night, as she gathered her bag to leave, Graham stood with her. I want to try something tomorrow, he said. She turned, what is it? You'll see. The next morning, she found the living room rearranged. The yoga mat was spread out in the center, pillows stacked nearby. He stood at the edge, balancing without the cane. I want to try without support, he said. She frowned slightly. That's a big leap, you don't have to push yourself. I'm not, he said, not physically, emotionally. She waited. I want to let you help me, really help me, if you'll still touch me. Her heart beat once hard. I never stopped being willing, she said. He nodded once. She moved to him slowly, always giving time for him to retreat. But he didn't. When she reached for his waist to stabilize his posture, his breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. Her hands were warm, steady. Ready, she asked. He nodded again. And together they began the most basic pose, standing tall, spine aligned, feet planted like roots. But for Graham, it was the most vulnerable one of all. She held his side lightly as he lifted one foot, bringing his balance to center. When he swayed, she steadied him. When he leaned into her slightly without meaning to, she didn't draw back. When he breathed again, it was slow and full. After a long minute, he exhaled. I didn't flinch. She smiled, no, you didn't. And in that breath, something shifted, not just physically, something deeper. A man who had once refused to be touched now stood, chest rising and falling, grounded by the care of someone who asked nothing from him but truth. It was not a miracle. It was something quieter. Something earned. The morning after he stood without flinching, Nina arrived to find the door not only open, but the curtains drawn back in every room. Sunlight spilled across the wood floors, catching dust motes in golden halos. The air smelled of steeped tea and something faintly citrus, like someone had finally opened a window. She found him in the dining area, poring over old architectural sketches spread across the table. A pencil rested between his fingers, tapping absently. His sleeves were rolled up, his scars visible, unhidden. You draw, she said softly, surprised. Used to, he replied, not looking up. Haven't since the crash, my hands would shake. And now, they're steady. He looked up at her then, and for once there was no tension in his shoulders, no guarded silence, only presence. I've been thinking about rebuilding Lucia's studio, the one we kept in the mountains. Everything burned with the wreckage, but I remember the angles, the way the light came in from the east. She'd want that, Nina said. I think so too. She sat across from him and watched as he moved the pencil again, firm lines, deliberate strokes. There was something soothing in the way he worked, controlled but not rigid, as though creating again helped him make space inside himself for something more than grief. She used to say my hands were always building something, even when I didn't know what. You're still building, Nina said gently. He looked at her, am I? Yes, just not with steel and glass, with trust. He didn't respond for a moment, but then he set the pencil down and held her gaze. Then let me ask you something. Anything. What does it mean when the one helping you heal is the only person you're afraid to lose? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, feeling the quiet weight of his questions settle around them. It means, she said, you've let yourself be seen, and once that happens, the stakes get higher. He was still, watching her the way a man watches a storm he knows will change the shape of his world. Do you ever let anyone care for you, Nina? He asked. That struck deeper than she expected. She looked away, her fingers tightening. Not often, she admitted. It's easier to be the steady one. No one notices what you've buried if you keep showing up with calm hands. He nodded slowly, as if recognizing something familiar in her answer. I want to know what you've buried. Why? Because you're the first person I've trusted to touch me since she died, he said quietly. And now I don't just want to be touched, I want to reach back. The words cracked something in her, not just tenderness, longing, because despite her control, despite her professionalism, she had begun to carry his pain with her after hours. His story lingered in her kitchen, in the quiet moments between shifts, in the way she looked at her own hands. And now here he was offering something back. She reached across the table and rested her hand over his. This time his fingers curled into hers without hesitation. "I've been alone for a long time too," she whispered, "longer than I like to admit." They didn't speak for a while. But when he turned his hand palm up and held hers properly, fully, gently, it was as intimate as anything she'd ever known. Over the following weeks he walked farther. He laughed, sometimes without catching himself. He let other staff members see him in the hallway, nodding briefly instead of disappearing behind closed doors. Once he helped another patient in the therapy room lift a fallen cane. The nurses whispered less and watched more. But it was only with Nina that he lowered his guard completely. They began sharing meals in the garden, under the arbor where jasmine had just begun to bloom. He'd limp slightly still, especially after a long session, but he never asked for the wheelchair again. Nina would sit beside him, not across, their elbows sometimes brushing, their silence now companionable rather than strained. One evening, as dusk settled in warm and purple, he asked, "When does your contract here end?" 2 months. And after that? I don't know, maybe travel nursing again, maybe something quieter, I haven't decided. You could stay. Her breath caught. You mans here. I means with me. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't teasing. His voice was steady, eyes soft. I don't want to be your patient forever, he said, but I also don't want to lose this, whatever we're building. Nina hesitated, not because she didn't want it, but because she did, and that scared her more than she expected. I need to know you're not asking out of gratitude. I'm not. Then why? Because when you walk into a room, he said, the world feels bearable, not easy, but bearable. I don't want to go back to who I was before you. She touched his hand again. I don't want to go back either. He turned his hand over, linking their fingers together. Then don't. That night he invited her into his memory, not his bed. He showed her the sketches of Lucia's studio, the half-written letter he'd never sent to her family, the watch she once wore, still ticking faintly on a shelf in the corner. She was my first great love, he said. And she always will be, Nina said gently. I don't want to replace her. You couldn't. He looked up, but I want to make room. She brushed her thumb across his knuckles. Then I'll meet you there. And in that moment, surrounded by echoes of the past, something unspoken bloomed between them. Not a replacement. A beginning. The air turned cooler as late summer softened into fall. Leaves began to gild the edges of the trees outside Marigold Clinic, and the garden that had once felt wild with bloom now held the quiet grace of fading things. Graham noticed the shift more keenly this year. He found himself pausing before the window, watching the wind rustle through the lavender, noticing, breathing. It had been 3 months since he touched Nina's hand for the first time. 2 since he first kissed her, slow, uncertain, like someone asking for permission with every breath. It wasn't hurried, it wasn't desperate, it was full of reverence, the kind of kiss that says, I thought I'd forgotten how. And 1 month since he asked her not to leave. She hadn't answered with words then, she simply stayed, that had been enough. But now time moved differently. Now her contract was officially ending, and her duffel bag sat packed in the corner of her small apartment on the clinic grounds. Not because she wanted to leave, but because the rest of the world still existed, and he had to be ready to meet it. Do you think it'll feel different? Graham asked one afternoon as they walked the full loop of the gardens, something that had once seemed impossible. What? When you're not here because of duty, when you're here because you chose to be. Nina smiled. I chose that a while ago, you're just catching up. He stopped, resting a hand lightly on the curve of her shoulder. Then let me say it clearly, I want you to stay not as my nurse, as my partner, my person. The word felt strange in his mouth, partner, but it fit better than any title he'd worn before. It held no power dynamic, no debt, only choice, only care. She studied him, something tender and steady in her gaze. I didn't fall in love with a patient, she said. I fell for the man who reached back, who let me in. He nodded quiet, then added, I want to build something again, not a company, not a legacy, just a life with you in it. Her reply was a whisper against the wind, then start with me. A month later he moved out of the clinic, not in a limo, not in silence, but in a borrowed sedan with Nina at the wheel, jazz humming from the speakers and a thermos of tea in the cup holder between them. His gait was still uneven, but he walked on his own now. He no longer asked for help before accepting it. They didn't go far, just to the edge of the forested hills where the ruins of Lucia's old studio still stood in the earth. Stone foundation, burned beams, broken glass half buried under moss. He stood in the center of it with Nina beside him and whispered, "I'm ready to remember without punishing myself." And together they began the slow process of rebuilding. Not a monument to grief. A sanctuary for something new. He designed, she painted. They argued about skylights and insulation. He made tea in the afternoons while she read aloud from books she found at the market. They fought once about control, about fear, about what it meant to share your whole self with someone who saw everything. But afterward, they sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket and he said, "I'm still learning how to let someone stay." "You're not alone in that," she said, "I am too." Healing didn't come all at once, it never does. Some nights he still woke with his chest tight, reaching for someone who was no longer there. But when he opened his eyes now, Nina was there, curled close, her hand steady on his heart. Other days it was she who wept quietly in the kitchen, grief from her own past surfacing like tidewater. He didn't ask questions. He just came to her, wordless, and wrapped his arms around her back until the shivering stopped. There was no finish line, no perfect arrival. Only presence. Only this day, then the next. And then one morning, he touched her cheek in the soft hush before dawn and said, "I'm not afraid of being touched anymore." Nina smiled, eyes still closed. "I know." He pressed his forehead to hers, voice rough with something sacred. "But with you, I crave it." She pulled him closer and whispered, "Then don't let go." He didn't. He never would. And in the quiet, golden space between their breaths, a life, tender, fragile, honest, began again, not despite their scars, but because of them.